Hi, welcome to session two of the second topic of the semester, the Spanish colonization of Texas. So, in session one, just to recapture what we have covered so far, we have been looking at the Iberian background of colonial Texas, Spanish Texas, that is to say. So, for that purpose, we have looked at Spanish history very briefly in terms of some of the major moments, developments again in Spanish history that shaped the society, that shaped the culture of Spain in a way that enabled us to understand the kind of features and characteristics that the Spaniards brought to the New World in order to form their societies, to form their colonial societies in this case. So it is a really good, again, exercise in terms of just understanding where the Spaniards were coming from, the kind of world they inhabited, what were some of the major historical stages of development that shaped the way they saw the world around them, the way they saw other societies, for example, in which they live with or they encounter, the way that they practice their religion, for example, what was their faith like, and so on and so forth, what kind of laws were important, etc. So again, we were just looking in the first session at several factors in Spanish history, in the history of Iberia, in this case, the Iberian Peninsula, that were important in shaping the society and the culture of the Iberian peoples. And of course, we looked at, the ancient peoples, of course, of Iberia in terms of how diverse they were ethnically, linguistically, culturally, that the Iberian Peninsula was extremely diverse and its makeup in the population, for example. We were looking at that as well in several regions. Again, there were several groups that we looked at. And then we were looking at some of the very early religious beliefs and practices centered on nature worshiping, for example, and also the animal cult, the cult towards the worshiping of the bull, for example, and the bullfight as a form of ritual combat, if you will, and ritual sacrifice as well. We're looking at that as well. We also looked at the influence of Rome, the Roman era, the Roman Empire extended into Iberia, and through 4 centuries or so of Roman rule, of course, we see Roman civilization, Roman culture influencing also some of the major features and characteristics of the Spanish people, such as Roman laws, for example, the formation of Roman cities, Roman religion, and Roman language as well. Latin, for example, will be the root for Spanish much later. So the Romans really left an imprint, again, in the Iberian peoples, and we also looked at that quite closely. Also, of course, with the spread of Christianity, again, once the Romans converted to Christianity, we looked at that as well. So this is another moment, again, that we were actually looking at. After that, after the Romans, we were looking also at the rise of feudalism in Iberia, with the invasions, the Visigothic invasions. We were looking at, again, that after the fall of the Roman Empire, we're going to see nomadic tribes, nomads, in this case, hunters and gatherers from Central Europe, otherwise known as the Visigoths, that are on the move. And they're going to be now moving into areas that were previously occupied by the Roman Empire. And they're beginning to raid some of those communities and in many cases invade them and, create, of course, a series of kingdoms across different areas of Europe. And Iberia will be one of those areas, again, that will receive those Visigothic invasions, of course. And with that, we're going to see the rise of feudalism. We were talking about, again, that how in Iberia, we're going to see the formation of militaristic kingdoms that were formed by strong men, many of whom were connected to the Roman Empire, that are going to come forth to offer protection to people. When people were left without protection, that is to say, as the Roman Empire disintegrated, a lot of Roman communities and and a lot of settlements and communities within Iberia that were previously ruled by the Romans are no longer protected by the Romans. So that created the need to actually offer protection by strong leaders, knights, in many cases, generals who were previously connected to the Romans. They're going to now create, again, the feudal states, monarchical states, in which they offer protection to people from the raidings, from the invasions of the barbarians or the nomadic tribes. And in return for that protection, people began to pay tribute, again, as a form of service that was being paid. Just like clients pay for a service, again, what we see is the formation of a society in which people were now accustomed to pay tribute to their lords, the lord protectors, whether it was the landlord, for example, a knight or a king. And this created a kind of society that is going to characterize Spanish society all the way to the discovery of America, and of course the coming of the Spaniards to the Americas to establish their colonies. So they're going to bring feudalism along with them, in that this is how they're trying to organize the society in the Americas as well, in that there's going to be landlords or a caste or group of people that are going to make the decisions for the settlements, for the communities, for the colonies. And their responsibility is not just to make the decisions as leaders, but also to protect people and offer protection in times of emergency or crises or raidings, etc., by different groups who are going to be, of course, in this case, there will be nomadic tribes, indigenous peoples, for example, in Texas, that are still very nomadic, like the Apaches and the Comanches. And of course, there's going to be a group of landlords that are going to be protecting, of course, those communities. And in turn, people will be, in a certain sense, paying tribute for that protection to the patron or the patron, the lord, again, the landlord, etc. And of course, the governors, etc., again, of those provinces. So it was a feudal society that was transplanted into the New World in places like Texas and elsewhere, wherever the Spanish are creating, of course, settlements and colonies. Those colonies were very feudalistic in their structures, of course. So now let us turn now our attention to the slide. So we continue with, again, understanding the Iberian background of colonial Texas. So in every point that I'm actually elaborating here, when we're looking at Spanish history, I will be connecting, of course, the significance of whatever's happening in Iberia with how Texas is going to develop, how the Spaniards are going to create a colonial society, a colonial culture, in Texas. In other words, trying to see the connection between Spain and Texas in this case. All right, so this is again another moment that is going to also shape Spanish culture and society is the Arab invasion of Spain. Again, this is going to leave a very strong mark on the psyche, on the mentality, the culture, the values of the Iberian peoples again. And when the Iberian Peninsula was invaded in the year 711 AD by the Arabs, who are now on the move away from the Middle East. Again, we're going to see the rise of Islam in this case, in the Middle East. Around those times, and again, there's going to be an expansion of the Arab peoples in the religion of Islam, of course, across the Middle East. Eventually, of course, they're going to enter into areas like North Africa and North Africa will be colonized by the Arabs. And there's this also the spread of Islam, of course, wherever the Arabs are going. And eventually, from Africa, from North Africa, the Arabs are launching an invasion into Europe proper from the West, and they'll be able to occupy and control the Iberian Peninsula for the most part, for 7 centuries. Again, for initially they took most of the peninsula, but as we'll see again in just a few minutes, of course, they're going to be losing territory gradually over the course of centuries until they were, of course, repelled finally by the year of 1491. Just 1 year before the discovery of America. Again, the Turks, as they were called back then, the Moors, the Turks, are going to be expelled finally out of Iberia. So it took really 7 centuries for the Iberian peoples to regain the peninsula, to regain what is called today Spain, and expelled, of course, in this case, the Turks who had invaded the peninsula and occupied most of it in the very first decades and centuries, starting in 711 again, 711 AD. And this is, again, a very important development because, again, this is going to leave a very strong imprint on the Iberian peoples. Again, the takeover of the kingdoms of Spain. Remember, we talked about the formation of different kingdoms during the age of feudalism. Again, during the age of feudalism, we're going to see local strongmen, if you will, creating a little principality, a little kingdom that they ruled, and they offer protection for people in return for tribute. So we talked about that a moment ago. So there were, again, a series of different, kingdoms that were formed after the fall of the Roman Empire in 450 AD. But about 3 centuries later, what happens is that there's yet another invasion into the Iberian Peninsula. In this case, we're not talking an invasion from, tribes coming from Central Europe, the Visigoths, but rather this is coming from also there were initially the Arabian warriors that are spreading Islam were also nomadic. Okay, there were also nomadic tribes that are on the move, and they're expanding, of course, their dominion, their territories, and establish a series of colonies which really they call a caliphate. Okay, a caliphate is one of the terms that the Arabs use for denoting a certain province that is tied directly to a larger entity, if you will, like a colony, in other words, that is directly ruled by them, in other words. So the entire Iberian Peninsula after 711 AD becomes a caliphate, a colony again of this larger empire. That was spreading very fast during that century of the 700s and beyond. And eventually this is going to also spread to the east of the Middle East, all the way to North India. The northern part of India will also be occupied and colonized, by the way, by Islamic tribes as well. Okay. So this is, again, the beginning of what is called Muslim Spain. It's Muslim, okay? Because the rulers now, okay, the leaders, the people that control the caliphate or the colony, of course, are from the Middle East. So they're bringing Islam, okay, with them. So there's going to be now yet another group, another ethnicity added to the multiplicity of ethnicities that existed in Spain at this time. So there will be yet another group coming in, of course, the Arabs and of course the Turks that are coming as well with them around this time as well. and they're going to become part again of the society, of this diverse society as well. And there's the presence, of course, of Islam as well during this time. Of course, there is Christianity, because Christianity was introduced by the Romans through the missionaries, if you remember, sending missionaries and, building missions in the Iberian Peninsula for converting the population of Iberia, or Hispania, it was called. But now there's also the presence of Islam, of course, in this part of Europe, and of course, what 7 centuries of occupation again is going to do on Iberia is influence the society and the culture in some ways. Okay, it's not going to transform Iberian culture completely. Christianity is not going to go away, for example. We know that. But there were certain cultural elements that the Arabs and Islam is going to leave on the culture of Iberia. For example, the food. Okay, when we talk about food culture, what they call Spanish food, for example, there's a lot of elements from the Middle East. Okay, Middle Eastern food is not necessarily identical to Spanish food, but they share many commonalities. Again, there's many common elements. Okay, the spices, for example, the way people marinate the beef that people grill, for example, the rice, the stews, for example. They're very reminiscent of the kind of spices and rices and stews that Middle Eastern people actually cook. So there is going to be an influence, again, left upon the Spanish people from, of course, the traditions, the practices that the Arabs are going to bring. And one, of course, is food. The other one is music. If you listen to Spanish music, if you happen to study music, for example, notes, scales, etc. So the Spanish scale, as it is called, the one that is mostly used for singing or for playing musical instruments, is almost identical to the Arabian scale. There's only, I think, one note that differentiates them. So the scale, the way people use the notes to build music, that is to say, and the way people sing. When you listen to Spanish classical music, going back to, let's say, the 12, 13, 1400s, even today, when you listen to Spanish music, so it has, elements of Arabian music, okay? Arabian notes, Arabian arrangements, in this case, they're very, very similar. You can see that they share the same roots. If you study both, again, Arabian and Spanish music. So there is that influence. Of course, language, there's going to be the introduction of many Arabian words into the Iberian Peninsula. And over time, those words are going to be integrated into the local languages. Even Spanish today, those that study linguistics understand that there's many words in the Spanish language that are Arabian. And we just don't know don't think about that. It is better said, just because we just associate them with Spanish. We think that because this is part of the Spanish language that has been, spoken for many, many centuries, we just think that that's just original Spanish. But in fact, there are many, many, many Arabian words embedded already in the Spanish language. In architecture, when you see the cathedrals, the Catholic Church, it is very, very common in Spain to look at the cathedrals in the shape of domes, for example. Okay, domes, the dome churches or cathedrals that are, very decorated and adorned with paintings, etc., of saints, etc. Well, that architecture itself was introduced by the Arabs and later on the Turks that are going to also rule Iberia. And so the Iberian people appropriated that style of architecture of their temples, and they constructed temples, of course, for the Catholic religion, of course, but that shared a lot of the structures and commonalities of the Arabian architecture. Temples of worship, that is to say, how they're supposed to look like, and this is again the way we build them, and so on. And so we're just accustomed to see a Catholic Church in that fashion, without thinking that this came from this influence again of the conquest. This is the conquest again of the Arabian Muslims again of Iberia, and that 7 centuries again they're going to leave something. They're going to leave something in the culture. They're going to leave something in the society, even though they're going to be later on retreating and leaving the peninsula. They're going to be expelled eventually in 1491. Nonetheless, again, those 7 centuries of influence pretty much stayed within the Spanish people. And of course, this is something that the Spaniards are going to bring to the Americas, places like Texas, whenever they build their cathedrals, for example, or they introduce their foods, their music, and so on. They introduce the Spanish language, which was already heavily influenced, again, by this Arab occupation. Okay, so again, this is first and foremost, again, the first item that we're discussing here, in this second session, after we have discussed the others in the first session, again, that we just mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, again, is the Arab invasion, okay, in 711, of course. And then, after understanding that there's going to be, of course, that influence that is going to span for 7 centuries, there's yet another component of that chapter of the Arabs occupying Spain for 7 centuries that also is going to shape Spanish society and culture in very, very profound ways. And that is that during those 7 centuries of Arab occupation, the Spanish people, well, in this case, we're called Iberians, in this case, they're going to organize themselves in so many different ways in order to try to regain or reconquer Spain, back to return control of Spain, of the peninsula, back to the Iberian kings, in other words. So instead of just, just allowing, if you will, the occupation to continue uncontested, what we're going to see is that the Spanish people, the Iberian people, are going to try to repel the Arabs and the Turks from Iberia. And this resistance, if you will, is going to take 7 centuries. Okay, so this is an ongoing process. It's a historical process that lasted literally 7 centuries. It initiated, roughly speaking, in 760, just a few decades after the invasion of 711. But we're going to see that by 760, there is already an intense effort by the northern, in this case, the northern kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula that were not conquered by the Arabs, that they're going to now work tirelessly in order to push the Arabs as far south as possible until finally they'll be totally expelled, by the way. So this is a process that continued until 1491, when finally the Arabs were expelled. And it's called La Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. Reconquista is the Spanish word for reconquest. Okay, so this is a very, very dramatic, very important, very intense historical chapter in the Iberian history that is going to shape the way Spain is going to develop their institutions, their way of organizing society in general, how people should be organized, leadership, for example, how the leaders need to be also organized, and so on and so forth. This is going to reshape, again, completely the culture and society. And this is going to be very, very important, because if you pay attention to the year 1491, when finally the Reconquest comes to an end, finally the last Turks are repelled from the Spanish Peninsula or the Iberian Peninsula. A year later, Columbus discovers America. So it's almost back to back, that just a year after the Reconquest comes to an end, now the Spaniards are going to now shift their attention to the Americas, because they have discovered a new world. They're going to be coming, establishing colonies. So their memories, their experiences of the Reconquest are still very fresh, so to speak. So the way they're going to see the new world, the way they're going to try to organize it, will be identical to the way that they have been organizing themselves for 7 centuries to repel the Moors, or the Turks in this case, from Iberia. Okay, so again, this concerted effort by the Spanish kings, particularly the Spanish kings of the north, who were, again, very resistant in terms of not allowing the invaders to defeat them, etc. What we're going to see is an alliance, if you will, between the Spanish kings and the church in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church. They're going to come together, make an alliance, if you will, for both the church and the kings to work together to try to regain the lost kingdoms. In other words, the kings are going to be organizing, again, the battles, rallying people and recruiting people and so on. And at the same time that they're fighting the Arabs, the Moors, as they were called, to the south, and trying to regain those kingdoms, trying to expand Christianity. Okay, so the idea is not just to regain the peninsula, but rather to return the Iberian Peninsula back to Christianity, so he can rejoin the Church of Rome, that is to say. So this is a very important, again, because this is not just a practical strategy of trying to regain territory, but rather also this is a religious battle, if you will, between different faiths and so on. And the idea of, again, the Church of Rome is to, again, aid the kings in every possible way to gain more and more territories for the Christian faith, in other words. Again, so this is a process that spanned for many, many centuries. This alliance between the kings and the church is going to strengthen the relations. And as we'll see, the idea of church and state is also going to come about, particularly in Spain, in that it is impossible to separate church and state, because those 7 centuries in which the Spanish kings were fighting the Moors, they were trying to also spread the faith, defend Christianity, and in this process, again, the church and the kings were pretty much acting as a single entity. So for them, it's going to become very hard to separate the functions of the state, the practical functions of administering the state, from the functions of the church, which was, again, administering the religion, matters of faith, and they're, one in hand in hand. The kings are serving Christ, they're serving the church, they're, doing God's mission, God's work. In other words, that was the vision of the Spanish kings. In other words, they rule on behalf of the divine, on behalf of God, and so on and so forth. Again, so again, this is going to be very important as to how Spain is also going to look at the process of colonization. Okay, whether we're talking about Texas or elsewhere, is that the colonizers in this case, and even the Spanish monarch that is sending colonists and so on, is not just sending people to the New World to settle and create colonies, but to spread Christianity. Okay, and spreading Christianity was one of the missions of the king, and of course, acting in unison with the Church of Rome, of course, together spreading Christianity in the New World. All right. So again, the stages of the Reconquista, again, it was just stages that again, in those 7 centuries, we could see that by 790, there were already, significant territories gained back from the Arabs again. And by 790, you can see that by 900, there were far more territories added, in which now the Spanish kings are gaining more and more control of Iberian territory. By 1150, it was almost half of Iberia had been regained. So again, by 1150, you can see that the trend is that more and more the occupant force, if you will, are on a retreat. They're losing more and more territories, and by 1300, there's one last kingdom, one last stronghold left. That will be lost by 1491, by the way. All right. So, what is the legacy of the Reconquista? In other words, how is this going to shape Spanish culture and society in a way that we understand colonization in the New World? Again, Texas, for example, the Texas region, the Texas province that the Spanish are going to settle and colonize. Again, the legacy in those 7 centuries of ongoing fight, this is ongoing. Again, it's ongoing. Might be maybe a few years, in which there is a relative peace between the Spanish kings and the Moors in the south. But again, it's an ongoing process. The peace doesn't last very long. So one of the legacies is the strong monarchical states. That is to say, because there was 7 centuries of ongoing warfare, there was the need for strong leaders, for strong leadership. So whenever a territory was regained, we're going to see the formation of a monarch, a ruler, in this case, a king, who is going to acquire significant authority. He's going to exercise significant authority in order to mobilize people rather quickly, because it was needed. Because they were always constantly in times of war. In other words, this is an ongoing warfare. So what you need is a leader that acts quickly, and that the person is very strong, has significant authority to order people to battle and so on. And of course, he needs to be, of course, a leader. In other words, a very strong leader. So we're going to see the formation of a strong monarchy, okay, during this time. Something that we see, of course, in the colonization of the New World by Spain is that, again, the monarch was the absolute ruler, not only of Spain, but he was the supreme ruler also of the Spanish colonies as well. All the Spanish colonies, again, the supreme, ruler was the king. And the king passed a law. It was pretty much obeyed everywhere, okay? Even, again, in things like, Spanish Texas in the late 1700s, again, to that fashion, to that manner. Again, so number 2, also La Reconquista, the Reconquest, shaped Spanish culture in those 7 centuries, because it was constantly in war. Spanish culture will become extremely militaristic. The Spanish military culture, that is to say, is oriented towards, the necessity and the practice of war. Okay, it was a necessity because they were, again, battling, of course, invaders and so on for 7 centuries. So it was a necessity, and because they got significant practice for 7 centuries, they developed, of course, tremendous skills. Okay. Perhaps even more skills that at this time in history in Europe, more than any other, of course, group in the European continent, by the way. They're highly militaristic in nature. So during those 7 centuries, we're going to see the rise of what today we refer as the conquistador. The conquistador is the conqueror. Okay. We know that when the Spaniards arrived to the New World, the people that were sent to explore the Americas initially, places like Central Mexico, like Hernan Cortés, or North America, Fernando de Soto, Cabeza de Vaca, etc. All of them were known to be, martial figures, pardon, generals, in many cases, high-ranking officials within the Spanish army that were trying to earn the title of conquistador, conqueror of new lands, conqueror of territories. Because back during Spain, during those 7 centuries I'm referring, is that the knights, the very skilled warriors that served the monarchs, that served the kings, that protected people, in other words, they were trying to earn the favor of their monarchs by going out in battle and trying to regain any territories from the Arabs, okay, in the Iberian Peninsula. They were trying to earn the favor because the agreement back during this time, called Reconquista, was that if a knight was sent into battle, and in that battle the knight was able to conquer a piece of land, a piece of territory for the king who sent that knight to battle, then therefore that knight will be elevated into nobility status. Okay, that person, that knight, will be called conquistador, a conqueror of lands for Christianity and lands for the Spanish king. And so therefore that knight will be given entitlements to control and own the land and extract tribute from the population that live there. So again, there was an incentive of the knights in Spain to create a regiment, a small force, in order to lead them into battle, gain any significant territory from the Arabs, and by gaining back any lands, they'll become the landlord of that land on behalf of the king. And they will be given, again, entitlements to extract tribute. They could, they're the landowners. So again, they're going to actually, become noble, in status, nobility. And again, that's one way of advancing in society. In Spain, it was very hard to advance in society. It was extremely hard because there's only two, in feudalism, again, there's only two social classes: the landlords, lord protectors, and the commoners. The knights wanted to become fully recognized as part of this, land owning caste or class, if you will, noble status, nobility, in other words. So they wanted to become conquistadors, conquerors of territories that the king can claim, and so they can be given entitlements. That is to say, they were again seeking land grants, and also tribute, but also glory. They're also in search of glory, recognition, fame for their epic deeds, that they're legends to be remembered, etc. There's poetry written for them. This is going to be an incentive. So this is very important because, when Spain came to the Americas, this is how the Americas are going to develop again, initially by the conquistadors arriving first. And we're going to see, of course, a series of conquistadors moving into different parts of the Americas. As I said, Hernan Cortés in central Mexico, There's going to be in Florida and in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, others like Hernando de Soto, for example, Cabeza de Vaca, and others, again, Coronado in present day New Mexico. And many of them, again, were just, martial figures within the Spanish ranks that wanted to become conquistadors. They were seeking land, they were seeking tribute and glory at the same time. Okay, so this is how we're going to see the development of colonial societies like Texas, for example. Also, again, in this military culture, we're going to see, of course, in that this within the Reconquista, in this military culture that is shaping Spanish society, there is also the element of the martial figures, the conquistadors, those knights, seeing their fights, seeing their battles as a crusade. In other words, that they're also taking the cross. Yes, we're seeking land, it's true. We're seeking also recognition, fame, tribute, but we also see themselves as well as battling infidels, people that don't believe in our faith, that are outside of the realm of God. They're outside of the church. So our crusade is, again, the mission to spread the cross, to spread Christianity as well. So they're crusaders as well. It's not just the practical matter of climbing the ladder, again, and trying to gain recognition and entitlements, but they also are believed to be by the society, and also they also believe that what they're actually doing is God's work. They're evangelizing, they're spreading the gospel, they're spreading the faith. They're building a Christian kingdom, which is the kingdom of God on earth. In other words, the evangelizing spirit. It's very important that for 7 centuries, the conquistador is also going to see himself in that role. And when they come to America, they're also going to bring the cross. As they're moving into the Americas, they're also going to carry the cross with them as they're moving again into the regions to look for land, look for riches, and so on and so forth. Okay, so urbanism and the plaza system is another very important feature, legacy again of the Reconquest. Urbanism is the concentration of population into urban centers, cities, that is to say, and cities that were structured very uniquely. In Spain, we're going to see that the concentration of peoples happened through the construction of main squares, or central plaza, the plaza system. And it was essential to build the cities during those 7 centuries in this particular fashion, because it was very practical, very necessary. So let me elaborate. Why urbanism? Why concentrate people and build cities? Well, because it is easier, again, to mobilize people when they're all concentrated in one spot. Because if they're all scattered across the landscape, again, if you're trying to organize people and lead them into battle or trying to protect them, the easier way is that instead of being scattered across the landscape, each in their own particular region, doing their own economic activities, that you want to concentrate them then. Okay, it is easier to protect them. It is easier to mobilize them in times of a raid or a fight, again, that might arise with the Moors, like the Arabs in this case. So you want to concentrate them. Okay, this is what we will call a Spanish pueblo, for example, a Spanish town. That is to say, the Spaniards were doing the same thing in Texas. Okay, they were doing the same thing in Mexico. Everywhere they went, is that they saw also the Native American population very scattered. And what they started to do is really move those peoples away from those locales in which they were scattered across the forest, across the wilderness, in many locations, living in small nested communities, and bring them to live in towns or out in the surrounding areas of a Spanish town. That is to say, to concentrate them. It was easier, again, to govern, to colonize
again, a region, if you bring people, of course, to that region for the purpose of managing the population better, then of course the way that the Reconquista is going to bring about this structure is, how do you build a town? What is the ideal way to do it? The Spanish came up with a structure, a blueprint, a layout that will be known as the plaza system. In other words, this is very, very, very visible when you go to, places like, for example, San Antonio and Austin, etc. Or you can go into all the other, provinces that the Spanish colonized, like New Mexico, California, Mexico City, everywhere. They say plazas. Plazas everywhere, and this is something that stays even today. The plaza system is very important in Latin America, particularly in Latin America, who that previously was known as Spanish America. Again, this is just a quick, picture of the plaza system. Again, it's a main square in which you're going to find in the main square the main political, religious, and military institutions headquartered there. Okay, so this is where you're going to find the central church. You're going to find also the fort from which all the generals are located. Okay, the military personnel, the leadership, again, are there as well. And also you're going to find, of course, the region, the political leader in this case, might be, a governor, might be a mayor, if you will, what we call today a mayor, which is the city official, the local leader, the political boss, etc., is there, of course. And again, they're the most important institutions that are in charge of the society. They're in charge of the town or the pueblo. Again, so the church, the state, and the military, those are the plaza institutions. Today, even when you go to, for example, Mexico, when you go to the plaza, you're going to find that in the plaza, there's going to be the cathedral, the church, might be also the government palace, is going to be like City Hall, for example, might be just besides it. And in the past, when you look, for example, decades in the past, more often than not, and throughout Mexico, for example, in Latin America, you will also find the military headquarters as well in the plaza itself. Again, so the plaza concentrated populations in the around the plaza. So around the plaza, what you find is all of the populations, all the residences, the houses that were built around the plaza. But the plaza itself was the hub of decision making, religious, military, and state. Okay, because the functions of the plaza. What is the function? What was the function? Why was so they concentrated all power? In other words, in the plaza, is because number one, you wanted to ensure the conversion of all peoples to Christianity, so it is easier to concentrate them around the plaza. And since the church is headquartered there, the church is going to conduct mass, for example. They're going to evangelize, spread the gospel, teach the Bible, and so on to the people that are all there. It might be coming from different ethnicities. They might even practice different religions, but you're trying to spread Christianity there. You're baptizing children. You're marry them within the church. So imparting the sacraments, for example, burials were all conducted by the church through certain Catholic rituals and so on and so forth. So you're pretty much accustoming people again to the religion, to the faith, which Catholicism, of course, and the religious festivals, the honoring of virgins, the honoring of saints. They all take place in the main square, what they call the plaza. They're celebrated there. So you summon all people, say, we're going to celebrate now the Christ, we're going to celebrate the Virgin, etc., or this particular saint, and everybody is seen, everybody's participating, witnessing that event, and that's one way that you convert people again. So again, this is one reason why the plaza, again, concentrated religious power because religion was being used to pretty much convert people in so many different ways, and rituals, ceremonies, and so on, festivals. Also, again, you concentrate also people in around the plaza, and you concentrate the main institutions there, because it was a good way to extract tribute. When they're all scattered across the landscape and everybody has to pay tribute, it's very hard to keep track when people are so far removed from the institutions that collect tribute, where there's the landlord, the church also collects tribute, etc. The king collects tribute. So one way to make sure that everybody was paying tribute is to have them live concentrated together in those towns, and the plaza serve as a way to create a census. You create a census, you count population, you know their names, where they live, etc. And so, you keep the books in terms of how many, people are paying tribute and who's falling behind, and so on and so forth. So again, for economic purposes as well. But yet, another function, and this is the most important, is the function of mobilizing people in times of war. So if there's going to be a raiding or a confrontation or a war, what the plaza was very useful for is for the leaders of that pueblo, of that settlement, to meet almost instantaneously in a spot in which it was very easy to summon them. So the plaza, the main square, was the central meeting point in which the generals rush forth, the local leader, what you call the mayor, for example, city official, will come forth as well, and also members of the church, and they're all together making prompt, quick, practical decisions at that point. Instead of they're all being scattered in different directions, then you have to call the religious leader to move people, etc. They're all already there. So they can meet very quickly, and they can reach some form of decision very quickly in order to mobilize people and, to call them for arms, etc., and so on, so forth. So again, the plaza system is going to be introduced in Texas, is going to be introduced in all New Spain, by the way, in all of the Spanish colonies, as a way that the Spanish officials are going to organize the societies. The colonies are going to be organized in that way. Okay, concentrating populations in urban centers, even though we're talking about Native Americans who have for hundreds of years lived scattered across the landscape for practical reasons, because they were tapping into certain resources, water, food, animal, species that they hunt and so on. Well, that particular strategy for survival is going to be altered in a significant way with the coming of, again, the Spanish colonies, because they introduced a new model called the plaza system, of course, and that forced people in a way to concentrate them, to live together in towns, for the missionaries to be converting the native population to Christianity, creating a census in this case, and for tribute purposes, and also, again, so they can mobilize people in times of warfare as well. All right, so let's move forward then. Again, so another moment that we're going to see in Spain, shaping the culture and the society, that will have an impact in the way the colonies are going to develop, how the Spanish are going to develop, how they're going to form their communities, their societies in the New World, is the unification of Spain, again, and the rise of a Catholic state, okay? The unification of Spain. In other words, we mentioned, up to this point, that Spain was not really unified. It was just, again, divided. What we call Spain today, Iberia, was simply divided into several different kingdoms, okay? And those kingdoms, the territories, have shifted in different centuries according to invasions or, the rule of the Romans, for example, the Visigoths, the Arabs, and so on and so forth. It's very, very, very fluid, very unstable in terms of that we don't have a unified Spain to speak of. That changed in 1467 when two kingdoms, the largest kingdoms of Iberia, actually married politically and literally, in this case, to unify those two kingdoms to become one. And in that process, this is how Spain is going to be born. Those two kingdoms was the kingdom of Castile and Aragon. Castile was governed by a queen, by the way, Isabella, and Aragon was governed by Ferdinand, or Fernando, as he was known. Again, so they're going to get married, and by marrying in 1467, they married the two kingdoms, and this is how Spain, the modern nation of Spain, is going to be born. Again, this is the Castilla, a very large kingdom, by the way, that pretty much occupied most of the territory of Iberia, and of course, Aragon here to the east. Both merge, unite with that marriage, and what we see is the formation of Spain. And of course, that unified their forces. Those two Christian kingdoms are uniting to unify their forces to battle together and finally expel the final kingdom, the last kingdom that the Moors, the Muslims in this case, control, the kingdom of Granada. Okay, so what is the significance of this event? Of course, for understanding the New World and colonization, etc., is that, again, this marriage created a new type of monarchy, in that this new nation of Spain, this new kingdom, if you will, was governed by a monarch that would be considered an absolute ruler, ruling on behalf of God, the divine rights of kings. So the king, in this case, is going to have total, absolute authority over every aspect of life. In other words, there's not going to be any political body that is also trying to create laws, etc., that is, challenging the authority of the king. Nothing of that sort. Here, the ruler is absolute, and the ruler is delivering the laws of God. In other words, the authority that was given to the king was actually given by God, because the Church of Rome actually put that blessing again on this new state, saying, yes, indeed, we hereby recognize the Spanish kings as to be the direct representatives, the spokesperson, if you will, of Christ. Okay, so they have the blessing of the church, and with that, of course, there's going to be a total marriage of church and state. In fact, this new monarchy that is absolute is a Catholic state. It made Catholicism the official religion of the new nation, of the new kingdom of Spain. This is the only religion that is allowed. Okay, so the era of people practicing different faiths and having different religion, this is coming to an end. Okay, now there's a central church. This is now a state, religion. Catholicism has become the religion of the state, and the Catholic Church is the official church and only church that can exist in Spain. That is to say, and one of the reasons, again, that this is happening is because what the Spanish monarchs realized is that in order to build a nation, or to build a kingdom that is so large, that is unified, this is the first time, that all Iberians are coming together and trying to form a single political community. What we call, today we call them nations, but back then it was a kingdom, a single kingdom. If they're so diverse, they come from many different ethnicities. They have different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. There's still a lot of religions, still a lot of linguistic groups. So how do you bring people together? What kind of elements can you use in order to promote a common identity? Okay, the sense of a single community. So they said religion. Let's use religion in this case to bind people together as Spaniards. In other words, that you're now Spaniard, even though you might be different from other Spaniards ethnically and so on, doesn't matter. But what binds us together is the religion, that we're all Catholic, that is to say. So Catholicism was used to promote a sense of community, to bring people together, promoting a Catholic identity, that is to say. So it was very important to enforce the idea, or the notion, that only the Catholic faith was the real, official, sacred faith that God had given, again, to humans. And of course, this is going to be promoted by both the monarchy and also promoted by the church. The church itself created an institution called the Spanish Inquisition. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition was simply an institution that the church used in order to force conversion. Okay, so those who practice other religions are going to face the Inquisition. Again, in terms of, there will be trials, people will be charged with crimes. For example, it was a crime, of course, to practice a different faith, a different religion. There were punishments for that, and so on and so forth. So people feared the Inquisition because this is the way Catholicism is enforced. In other words, we're not just here saying that we should all practice it, but rather, again, there's going to be an institution in charge of persecuting, if you will, the unfaithful, if you will, forcing conversion, forcing people to convert. And again, this transition towards a Catholic state made possible the expulsion of the Turks from Iberia. The last kingdom, the stronghold of the Turks was lost in 1491 when they lost the kingdom of Granada. So there was now a very unified effort by this unification of all the kingdoms, particularly the two largest kingdoms, again, Aragon and Castile, to come together now with the zeal, if you will, of the Catholic faith, that, look, we need to spread Catholicism everywhere. So there's still, of course, the Turks in the south who are not Catholics, so we need to expel them, in other words. So they were expelled. This is the end of the Reconquest. And of course, after 1491, even the Spanish Jews and other groups were also forced to convert to Catholicism, again, by the Spanish Inquisition. So there's this process again. The importance of this is that this is, something that is going to influence the development, again, of Spanish colonies in America. Of course, the idea that, okay, the king is absolute. He is exercising the will of God. So we follow what the king of Spain says. And there is the idea that as the Spaniards are colonizing the New World, whether we talk about Texas or other regions, is that they're also trying to promote a Catholic identity. Okay, a Catholic identity is very important. You have to convert the natives to Catholicism to bind them together, again, as, Spaniards. Okay, there's one way to turn them into Spaniards, even though they're, of course, from a different ethnicity, even though they have different ethnic, cultural backgrounds and so on. But if you convert them to Catholicism, they're going to become loyal subjects, again, of the king, because the king is the representative of the church. He's the representative of God, in other words. So if you're able to successfully convert the native population to Catholicism, political allegiance is going to be automatic, because the king is tied to the church directly. So if somebody is now a member of the church, that person will be a loyal subject of the king at the same time. So it's very important. You have to understand, again, the significance of this development prior to the discovery of America, how this is going to influence colonization, how the Spaniards are going to see the process of creating a colony. This is the way we do it. Okay, we go to a place, we spread Christianity. It's important. The missions, we send missionaries. It's important to promote a Catholic identity. Catholic identity is not only allegiance to the church, it's allegiance to the state as well. And again, you create loyal subjects as well. Okay, have to see that connection. Okay, very, very important. Um, at any rate, so again, the last, of course, thing I want to talk about, again, the Iberian influence, the Iberian background of colonial Texas, and this is extremely significant for understanding, of course, the conflict that is going to take place both in Europe and also in America between the Catholic Church or Catholicism and also the Protestants in this case. This is very, very important for understanding the future developments of Texas, is that uh, another, of course, significant event that shaped Spanish culture and society and Spanish policies, colonial policies, is the fact that in Europe, in 1519, 1520, 1521, there's going to be a very dramatic event that shook the foundations of the Catholic Church. And that is the Protestant Reformation. Again, so we're not here to discuss, everything about it, but just the essentials. Again, this was a Catholic monk from Germany, Martin Luther, who believed that the Church of Rome had departed from original Christianity, what he called primitive Christianity, the Church of Christ established 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years from his own perspective. So he proposed 95 reforms. Okay, so he proposed that the church needed to undergo reform, 95 different aspects regarding the teachings, the doctrine, the rituals, etc., that the church needed to do away. Okay, in very general terms, in order for the Church of Rome to restore original, what you call primitive Christianity. Again, this shook the foundations of Europe because at least half of the population of Europe in the coming decades, eventually in the coming centuries, are going to leave the church and become Protestants. Again, people that are leaving the Catholic Church in protest, and they're trying to reform Christianity in the ways that they believe will be more consistent with the teachings of Christ, the Protestants, in other words. So the Catholic Church is split in half. Half of the population of Europe remain Catholic, tied to the Church of Rome, and half leave in protest and create their own churches, Protestant churches, Protestant Christians, in other words. And again, in 1532, King Henry VIII turns England into a Protestant kingdom, breaks away from the Church of Rome, and again, this is the beginning of so-called, Protestantism in England. And so the significance of this, as we'll see, is that the church in Rome, as well as the Spanish kings, are going to react, of course, to this development. That there are people questioning, of course, the authority, the legitimacy of the church. They want to reform it. In many cases, they're leaving. And even some Spanish monarchs, some European monarchs, like King Henry VIII of England, they're also departing and breaking away from the Church of Rome because they believe that the Church of Rome needed certain changes, etc., in one way or another. So again, the reaction of the Church of Rome and the Spanish kings is one in which they're going to launch what is called a counter-reformations. In other words, a resistance against the Reformation of the Protestants, trying to stop it, in other words, trying to reassert the authority, the legitimacy, the validity of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church of Rome, that is to say. So there's going to be yet a stronger and stronger alliance between the Church of Rome and the Spanish monarchs to oppose the Protestants, both in Europe, but also in the American colonies. Okay, so this was another incentive for the Spanish king to see the need to still promote a Catholic identity and to enforce it by all means, in other words, and that this is the way we build a society. If we're going to build a colony in America, we're going to build provinces like Texas or, New Mexico, California, etc., across the Southwest, anywhere they go, they really, are pushing to colonize to build a colony as a Catholic society. In other words, this is the project of colonization. In other words, if we are indeed going to develop a colony, it has to be Catholic because there are Protestants, okay? And those Protestants, of course, are also trying to build colonies in America. When the English are arriving to North America to establish the series of colonies in the eastern seaboard of North America, they brought their own project of colonization in which they're trying to build English Protestant societies, Protestantism. So there's two different projects of colonization that are going to be contesting their regions, their territories. They're going to be at odds. They're in competition. That is to say that when the Europeans arrived, they don't have the same structure. They're not bringing the same ideas of how the colonies need to be developed, because the Spaniards bring their Catholic, of course, idea, the Spanish Catholic colony and society, and the English, of course, with Protestantism. Of course, they have their own different project of colonization. Okay. All right. So at any rate, so here again, we just going to just cover very quickly now the other part 2, and this is going to be rather quick. Again, it's a quick overview again of the discovery, conquest, and exploration. All right, so now again, this is the second part, and it's going to be short in a certain sense, shorter again than the first. That again, we're just going to swiftly understand the process by which the Spaniards are going to discover America. Very briefly understand the conquest itself of the Aztecs, and just look at very quickly at exploration. So again, the background to the age of discovery. The process of the discovery of America was part of a historical process that started back in the 1300s with the rise of long-distance trade, when the Europeans began to reach the Far East, places like India, China, the Middle East, etc. And of course, certain commodities were introduced to the Europeans from those markets, like spices, tea, gold, silks, and sugar, thereby beginning the era of long-distance trade and commercial exchange. So again, this was an incentive, a motivation for the Europeans to begin the process of, again, exploring the world, exploring trade routes, trying to accelerate the trade in order to accelerate this process of commercial exchange. So there was a commercial revolution in which people are now engaged in the massive exchange of merchandise and cargo across the old world. And that, again, initiated, again, the age of discovery. And people began to discover new lands. They began to explore bodies of water, particularly, again, when there was a technological revolution in navigation. In the late 1300s and throughout the 1400s, the Portuguese, who wanted to accelerate the trade, are really investing in trying to develop larger and larger vessels, again, that will allow them to carry large loads of cargo, merchant fleets, that is to say. So they're really working every year in the late 1300s and 1400s, again, to try to develop the kind of ships that will allow them to engage in this process of exploration, again, of the African West Coast, of course, because what they're interested is in pretty much finding a trade route to Asia. They want to deal directly with the peoples of Asia, like India, reach the spices of India, so they can bring them, of course, without the hassle of going inland and paying so many fees and tributes and costs, of course, with middlemen, of course, raising prices, etc. So there's going to be an intense effort in the 1400s to try to reach the spices of India by the Portuguese. And again, this is going to, over time, in the 1400s, develop an economic system known as mercantilism. This is the first international economic system, again, in world history. That all this commercial exchange that was taking place, the silks, the spices, the tea, the sugar, that is binding the different civilizations, the different continents of the world together commercially. This is going to give rise, again, to an economic system known as mercantilism that introduced the idea that gold was money, that gold was wealth. That is to say, gold. That is to say, this is how people pay for the commercial exchange. If you need to buy merchandise, you pay it with gold. Gold becomes the standard of money and wealth. Again, so the significance of this, again, is that since gold was becoming money, so there was an incentive to look for it. Okay. In what way? Well, one way is, number two, doing trade. Okay, if you engage in trading activities, you increase your chances of increasing your wealth, because if you're controlling a certain commodity, if you're producing it, you're selling it, for example, might be sugar, for example, might be tetra spices. Therefore, you're going to sell those commodities, for gold. Okay, so that was one. But the other one is you might also find gold, of course, somewhere. And so the conquistadors, again, were also looking for gold when they came to the New World. Okay, they were also looking for gold. And so the reason why they were looking for gold is because, again, they had entered this age called mercantilism. And this age of mercantilism pushed people to look for whatever it was considered to be wealth or money. And so they were either looking for gold deposits or mines or cities of gold, or they were trying to look for, of course, sources that will get you gold, like, for example, precious goods, precious commodities. Number three, of course, mercantilism also revolutionized the practice of agriculture. Now, people that own land, landowners, merchants, are using the land to produce cash crops. Okay, because this is the way you grow crops that are valuable. They have a commercial value. You can trade it for gold. So you increase your chances, of course, increasing your wealth. So again, this rise of commercial agriculture brought about by mercantilism in the 1400s, that is going to influence, of course, the thinking of the Spaniards when they discover America, is the fact that, again, this led to the rise of the plantation. Okay. The sugar plantation, particularly, the Spaniards are creating sugar plantations, and they're colonizing tiny islands on the west coast of the Spanish peninsula, like the Canary Islands, because they're interested in growing sugar for the world market. And the plantation itself was this kind of agricultural enterprise by which you grow a cash crop for export-led purposes. And then, of course, you increase your chances of advancing in society, again, increasing your wealth, that is to say. So what mercantilism actually created in the Spanish New Kingdom, of course, that is arising in 1467, is the pursuit of gold, land, and commercial agriculture. Okay, even before the discovery of America, there was already, again, this drive among the Spanish kings and the knights and so on to pursue gold, because gold was becoming the source of wealth, the source of what's called money and fortune. They were looking for land, of course, land that will be valuable in order to establish things like plantations for commercial agriculture. So they were not just looking for land for the sake of land, but rather to use the land for commercial purposes, that is to say. And this is one of the, again, influences that mercantilism had, of course, on the Spanish people. Of course, the discovery of America itself in 1492 was part of this process, again, in which the Spanish commissioned the Spanish kings, Christopher Columbus, to seek a trade route to the Asian markets in order to reach the spices. Again, Isabella and Ferdinand, the new kings of Spain, again commissioned, again, Columbus. And in 1492, of course, he ends up stumbling upon new land, we call America, of course, and establishing a series of colonies in the Caribbean islands, like Hispaniola and also in the Bahamas. And the Spanish are going to be the first ones to claim lands and territories in the Americas because they were the first ones to arrive when they commissioned Columbus in 1492 to reach the Indies, again, India, to reach China, but instead he ended up, of course, stumbling upon America. Now, of course, it is in this process that we're going to see the process of the conquest itself, the conquest, that is to say, the Spanish conquest. Here we're just going to talk about the Aztecs, okay, in very quick terms. He was like a knight, if you will, a martial figure within the Spanish army, stationed in the Caribbean island of Cuba, who was sent on an expedition in 1519 to meet one of the largest societies or civilizations that the Spanish have heard of from the natives of Cuba, this society was called the Aztecs. And there was a large empire. Cortez was looking for gold. He was looking for land. He was looking for glory as well. So he's going to take a small force into Mexico, an expedition, to meet, again, the leaders of the Aztec Empire with less than 1,000 Spanish soldiers. And in this expedition, very quickly here, again, he's going to, in just a matter of a year and a half, march into the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. And while he's there, of course, he's going to create conflict, of course. There's misunderstanding with the natives, and there's a series of issues that arise. We're not going to get into that, of course, in this discussion. But in only a year and a half, again, the Aztec Empire is going to fall. And the fall of Tenochtitlan finally, again, is in 1521. And this was really, again, the first time that the Spaniards are confronted with such a large force, a great civilization, again, in which they battle. And then, of course, this ends up in in the defeat of the Aztecs. Now, the question, of course, arises, why is it that the Spanish were able to conquer the Aztecs with such a small force, when the Aztecs, outnumber them by hundreds of thousands? There were like 200,000 people living in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. How is it that this small force was able to subdue, to defeat the Aztec Empire? So the lessons we learn is that, and this is very useful for understanding not only the conquest of the Aztecs, but literally just the encounters, the clashes between the Spaniards and other indigenous groups, whether we're talking about the Aztecs of central Mexico or the Incas of Peru, or we're talking about the indigenous peoples to the north of Mexico, like in Texas or New Mexico. It's the same thing, the same principle. So what I'm about to explain here is useful for understanding the larger picture, again. And that is the reason why such a small force of Spanish soldiers were able to defeat such a large empire like the Aztecs is because of their technology based on steel, the steel technology. And the Native Americans didn't have steel technology. Spanish did have that technology. They're coming from one of the steel civilizations. Spanish developed steel thousands of years ago because the iron ore, the raw material, was given to them by nature. It was easily available. It was on the surface of the earth. They took the iron ore, smelted, and pretty much created weaponry of various kinds, like swords, shields, muskets, armors, etc. Again, so geography played a key role in shaping, again, the development of technologies like steel. The Middle East, similarly, Asia, parts of South Africa, those were the steel civilizations. And the reason why they were, again, able to produce it is because nature provided that material, that raw material, easily to them, versus, let's say, the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of America, couldn't find iron ore anywhere. And it had to be mined. Of course, it was hidden from sight. Nature did not provide that raw material. That had to be mined even today with modern equipment, machinery, and so on. Again, so it was again very difficult for them to develop, of course, steel weaponry. So they were still using Stone Age technologies. Again, the Native Americans were using axes and flintstones, etc., blades made from rocks. So, they were using bows and arrows, etc. Again, so this is very important. Again, that the Native Americans are not going to have that type of technology. Of course, no iron tools, no steel, by the way. So the weaponry of the Native Americans was, again, useless to the shields, the weaponry that the Spaniards were using that protected them in many cases, not always, but protected them from the arrows that were thrown at them, etc. Again, not that they were totally immune, but again, they had far more advantage. Again, second, the role of La Reconquista. We talked about 7 centuries, worth of fighting the Moors in Spain, gave them a lot of skill. They were very skilled in warfare, very organized. They have developed so many different strategies. They were highly organized. It was a militaristic culture, by the way, per excellence. So that culture ended up in their, advantage in trying to mobilize troops, organize strategies, and so on and so forth. And again, this is another reason why the Spaniards were able to confront the Aztecs and other groups wherever they're going, of course. The role of epidemic disease, of course, is another feature of geography. Again, epidemics we know are, a phenomenon that arises from the interaction between humans and animals. Okay, animals carry certain parasites, certain viruses, and so on that live with them, but when they're transmitted to people, ends up again making the organism ill, and of course that sickness can be contagious and spread to others and so on. So we got again epidemics, of course, in Europe, epidemics in the Middle East, epidemics in Asia were very common because animal domestication again was very common in the old world. There were species of animals that did not exist in America, like horses, there were cattle, hens, pigs, sheep, goats, that in the old world people domesticated and lived in very close proximity with them. And due to this interaction, again, many of the peoples of the old world were able to ingest those parasites or those viruses, got sick, but over the centuries, they develop immunity, a certain resistance to those diseases. What we find here in the Americas is the Americas was isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, geographically speaking. So there was no exposure, again, for other, societies, for other peoples to bring those diseases. And also the animal species I just mentioned are not present in the Americas. So there was no animal domestication taking place in the Americas for people to, be exposed to the viruses of the animals, that is to say. So again, this is yet another thing. Again, there was no immunity to diseases. And of course, that ended up, of course, weakening, of course, the Aztec Empire, that when they were confronted with the Spanish in those battles, in many cases, there were outbreaks within the ranks of the Aztec warriors of yellow fever or smallpox that ended up decimating, of course, the leadership in a lot of those warriors and weakened them from within. So that's another thing, again, epidemics, the role of epidemics, of course. And of course, this is a byproduct of international trade. As people are doing trade, germs, of course, are extending around the globe. It's not just goods and ideas that are traveling all over the planet at this point, but rather also germs. Again, the capital, again, was affected by smallpox and yellow fever during the conquest. And again, this really ended up decimating pretty much vast numbers of people within the Aztec capital. And this is one of the reasons, again, why the Spaniards were able to defeat the Aztecs with such a small force, because, again, there was the element, again, of epidemics. Also, the role of Indian alliances. The fact is that Native Americans were never really united as a single people. Even within the Aztec Empire, there were significant groups of people who did not really like the Aztecs. So when they saw the Spaniards coming, they made alliances with Cortés, Hernan Cortés, this conquistador, if you will, that Spain had sent. So there were 30,000 Tlaxcaltecan warriors that pretty much followed him in battle to confront the Aztecs because they just didn't like, again, the Aztecs. The Aztecs were very fierce and conducted, human sacrifices, demanded communities to render, volunteers and people to be sacrificed in those temples. So a lot of people really did not like the Aztecs. So again, this is very important because everywhere the Spaniards go, they find communities, in many cases, in conflict with each other. So they are going to form Indian alliances that will help them, if you will, colonize an area, easier than if they were just battling everybody, in other words. And of course, the role of native religious ideas, again, there were, prophecies that the calendars believed in that allowed the Spaniards to defeat the Aztecs faster and easier because those ideas had to do with the end of the Aztec Empire and the end of the Aztec civilization. There were calendar prophecies that the Aztecs carried or kept that talk about the return of a god, again, that will return in a specific cycle of time that coincided. So it's a mystery that coincided with 1519 when Cortés showed up. In other words, in that same year, the Aztecs had prophecies in which the cycles of time said, in this year, there's going to be a god called Quetzalcoatl who's going to return, and he's going to pretty much end Aztec rule. So that was a psychological factor that convinced many Aztecs, not all of them, but a great many, including the emperor himself, that this was the end of Aztec rule. This is the end. Quetzalcoatl will come and destroy the Aztecs, that is to say. So they kind of accepted in many ways defeat, that it was inevitable, that we cannot win the battle of the gods, in other words. And of course, the idea that they needed to practice rituals, of course, warfare rituals in order to prepare for battle. This is also going to weaken, the ability of the Aztecs to organize and mobilize quickly and rush people forward for battle, because from their perspective, you just don't engage in battle in a practical way in that, so there's a force coming, let's go and fight. No, there's a force coming. Well, we need to practice rituals. We need to prepare. We need to do dances for many, many days at a time, summon the gods. And when we're ready, when we have the blessing of the gods, then we can go and engage the invader. So that really gave Cortés and his men plenty of time to escape, in many cases, very dangerous situations, and regroup and reorganize, because the Aztecs were so preoccupied with rituals of warfare that this gave the Spaniards an advantage for regrouping. And this is going to be also something that other indigenous groups are going to practice as well. When the Spaniards are arriving in many regions, they find that in many cases the natives need to conduct rituals and so on before they go to war. And again, this is going to weaken their ability, once again, to organize a defense, a resistance against the Spaniards. Again, so with that, we conclude session 2. When we come back in session 3, we're going to look briefly at the exploration of Texas, look at that exploration, and then we're going to just look at the formation of the settlements, the missions, the kind of enterprises in Texas that the Spanish brought and created, and look at the colonial period itself. But this background serves really everything we just discussed in session 1 and session 2, really to understand the process of colonization. In other words, where the ideas, where the institutions, the policies, why they're important, in other words. And now it's going to become very easy in session 3 just to see the formation of those missions, those forts, cattle ranches, etc., and how the Spaniards are creating a society in Texas. That's all I have for you. And then, again, session 3 is going to cover the remaining portion of the discussion. All right. Thank you. Goodbye.